I work at Ukrainian Catholic University. I'm graduate of that university. My master degree is in theology, and my doctoral degree is in philosophy. And I also run the department. I'm a chair of philosophy department. I spent all my life almost in Uku, and I'm sure you know many people from Uku because they're like everywhere, including Canada. What else? We were working together with Rud on the anti-corruption. I spent last 3 months in Rud's house. When the war started, I moved to Poland, and then from Poland, I went to Netherlands. And just 2 weeks ago, we returned home with my 3-year-old daughter. And we are again in the middle of the war, you know, watching it from the inside. It's quite you know, a thing to see from the inside. Yeah. It's a bit different than if you watch it on TV.
Yeah, I'll say, I'm sure it is.
Yeah. Okay, I think everything is working. I'm just gonna make Orissa co-host just in case our electricity fails or something like that. Good. Just one check. Yes, everything is working. Good. So I'll make a short introduction, and then Vic, I ask you to introduce yourself for a short introduction, and then we have this regular question of all our guests. So how was your week today? And that's actually regarding to the war, maybe just what you want to say about it. It's like our chronicle. And then we start our conversation about diaspora concepts in Canada. So, yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. This is, again, Don't Give Up Ukraine, our 22nd episode since the war in Ukraine started. And today we have our second episode when it on the subject of the topic of diaspora. The title we chose was Diaspora Concepts and Canada. And we are very glad to have here Professor Victor Satzewich from Ontario in Canada, and we are very happy because he is a specialist on both sides, Canada and the concept of diaspora. So very welcome, Vic. Nice to have you here. And of course, I'm again here with Orissa. Orissa Bila, maybe 1 or 2 words from you, Orissa.
Hello, everybody. It's again me, Orissa Bila, a philosopher from Lviv, Ukraine.
So, as usual. So, thank you. Vic, can you say a few words about you? Who is Victor Satzewich?
Sure. So thanks for the invitation, Ruud and Orissa. It's I appreciate it. I appreciate the chance to talk about these things. And so a little bit about me to begin with. I'm a professor of sociology at McMaster University in Hamilton in Ontario, and I've been here since 1995. I'm the past president of the Canadian Sociological Association. I've been a visiting professor at the University of Edinburgh, at Capital Normal University in Beijing, and way back in 1985, when I was still very, very young, I was a visiting professor at Chernivtsi, at the Chernivtsi University.
It's beautiful Czech building. So by the Czech architect, I forgot his name, but we have been there.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I was back a few years ago for a conference, and it's was still just as beautiful then. In this fall, I'll be a Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Peace and War Studies at Norwich University in Vermont. So I'll be spending the fall there. Over the course of my career, I've published 10 books as either author or co-author or editor. Among the more recent ones is a book called Points of Entry, How Canada's Visa Officers Decide Who Gets In. I got permission from the Canadian Immigration Department to go overseas and interview visa officers about how they make decisions and how they make how they assess credibility and risk. So I visited, I think, 11 visa offices around the world. I've published a textbook on race and ethnic relations in Canada. It's in its 5th edition, I guess. And earlier this year, I published a co-edited collection with my colleague Anna Vu on the Vietnamese diaspora. But I guess the reason I've been invited, well, I know the reason I've been invited for this conversation is a book that I published way back in 2002 called The Ukrainian Diaspora. And it was part of a series that was edited by Robin Cohen at Oxford University on global diasporas. And I was fortunate enough for him to invite me or ask me to write the contribution about the Ukrainian diaspora. So, I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And some of your listeners might be interested in one of my current research projects. I'm working with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Natalia Konenko-Friesen, who's the director. So I'm working with her and some other colleagues. And this is a project that started before the war, but it's on post-1991 migration from Canada, from Ukraine to Canada. And one of the things that we're interested in is the creating a demographic of immigrants from Ukraine since 1991, but also examining their socioeconomic and settlement trajectories. So we're using quite an innovative database that has been developed by the Canadian government that combines the landing records so that the data that immigrants use or provide to the government, they apply for permanent residency in the country, and they match that data with tax records, so we can kind of analyze how immigrants, including Ukrainian immigrants, are doing economically, how much money they make, how well they're doing relative to other immigrants, and so on. So we were quite excited about that project. We still are, but we're also hoping that to be able to extract some data on the folks who've been coming to Canada as a result of the war. And there is data, there should be data on those people. So down the line, I hope to be able to use that data set to at least describe who's been coming to Canada from Ukraine as a result of the war, and to start to unpack some of their experiences that way. So that's more or less about me, probably too much about me. But,
Oh, that's very interesting. So is there any reason why you have a special interest in this last project, what you're describing? So,
well, I mean, part of my one of the problems I have is I'm interested in a lot of different things. You know, I'm of Ukrainian heritage. My parents came from Ukraine to Canada after the Second World War. They were displaced persons. They ended up obviously settling in Canada. So I've always had an interest in things Ukrainian and things Ukrainian Canadian. And so that's partly what prompted me to become interested in the diaspora, 20, 25 years ago. And then I got interested in other things. And then it was really Maidan and the annexation of Crimea and the sort of frozen conflict in the Donbass and the movement of internally displaced people as a result of that started to get me kind of more engaged with Ukrainian immigration related topics. A couple of years ago, I sponsored there's a special program in Canada that allows students from Ukraine to come under internships. And so I sponsored a young student from Ukraine who was an internally displaced person to come and work with me. And she ended up doing her master's degree on IDPs in Ukraine. And so it's just been sort of a progression of interest. And next year is actually the 125th anniversary of the first Ukrainian settler arrivals in Canada. And so Natalia and I were, and that's partly what prompted the interest in the post-1991 waves of immigration is we're organizing, particularly Natalia, but I'm helping a little bit, some events, publications, and conferences to celebrate that anniversary. But obviously the war has impacted that, and that's going to change the tone of the conversation quite a bit, I think. But yeah, so it's that's kind of the pathway into that.
So, if I may ask you now, just change a bit from you to where you live, and so how was your experience with the war last week? And so, when it comes to that, or yeah.
Well, I guess like a lot of people that live in relative safety and comfort in the West, it was kind of, ever since the war started, I've had, feelings of kind of inadequacy and not being able to do enough. I don't know what enough would be, but certainly, continuing to feel relatively kind of powerless in the context of these broader, what sociologists call structural forces. And that hasn't gone away. I'm frustrated, even just this morning, you see the cruise missile attack on Wynnyckyi. It's essentially a terrorist attack on civilian targets. So that's obviously frustrating, disturbing. There's all kinds of, other ways to describe it. But I think in Canada, I don't know if you've heard, but the last, yesterday or the day before, the Canadian government has decided to release one of the turbines that helps to power the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. That those turbines there's a contract with the Canadian German company, but it's located in Canada, Siemens. And so the maintenance of these turbines happens in Canada. And so for the last several months, because of the sanctions, Canada has refused to ship that turbine back to Russia. But just a couple of days ago, the Canadian government decided to issue an export permit for this turbine to allow the Russians to continue to pump gas through the Nord Stream. And so that's raising a lot of concerns in the Ukrainian Canadian community about, and obviously in Ukraine, about the wisdom of this policy, because it also, as we're learning, it's committing Canada to allow for the maintenance of a number of other turbines that will be sent to Canada for maintenance over the next couple of years. And so, I was listening to a spokesperson for the Ukrainian government last night being interviewed, and it's hard to disagree with Ukraine's position on this, that this is, there's a lot of disappointment in Ukraine about this decision, in part because it's kind of the thin edge of the wedge. If Canada's willing to make an exception on the sanctions on this turbine issue, it kind of opens the door for other countries to also make exceptions to get around the sanctions. And I mean, the Canadian government is justifying it on the grounds that, well, the world, or we need to support, we need to make sure that Europeans stay supportive of Ukraine as the war progresses, and it looks very much like it's going to continue for longer, certainly into the winter. And so that the gas supply to Europe is going to be an issue coming up. And so the Canadian government is framing this decision as a way to ensure that Europeans continue to too much from gas shortages. I'm no expert on how gas moves around the world, but I'm learning more, and I think other people like me are wondering why Canada didn't choose to pursue other alternatives. That the gas lines are still running through Ukraine, and so some have argued that it's still possible for Russia to send gas through Ukraine to Europe, and so why not use those existing structures, which would also then benefit Ukraine. So there's a whole politics there that I'm not fully competent to analyze. But anyway, so it's been sort of a frustrating week in that respect.
So how do you listen to that, Alyssa? Because you are now in Ukraine again, of course. So,
this is really frustrating, and that's interesting for me, because what really makes a difference with Canada is the big number of Ukrainians that live there. The Canadian Ukrainian diaspora, I think, is the biggest in the world right now. I mean, I think Saskatchewan is like a Ukrainian. We just put the Ukrainian flag over there, and that's Ukrainian land, by a number of the ethnic Ukrainians, or people who came from Ukraine, who have Ukrainian roots. And so far, Canada was very supportive of Ukraine, and we really appreciate this. And I think the role of the Canadian and American diaspora in Ukrainian independence is huge. And so now, when you see moments like this, it's really disappointing. But of course, we understand that it's not just about the Ukrainians who live there, but it's a country in general, and their business interests. And of course, it's disappointing. But still, I mean, this is very, let's talk about this political dimension of diaspora. You know, we have a lot of Ukrainians now being moved into different countries in Europe and in Canada, and of course the United States. They are all over now, scattered. But I think one of the most interesting things about Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and in the United States, and I think in Canada it's even more than in the United States, that it's really politically active. It's really making a difference in and it's contributing to the and really influencing Canadian policies regarding Ukraine and regarding Ukrainians. And I think we are very proud, of course, of all these people of Ukrainian heritage and Canadian government. But where, if as a scholar, do you find an explanation for this? Why there are communities like this that just appear on the map of the world, that really become so influential, have such a strong political consciousness? What is there really about the Canadian diaspora that makes it so different?
That's a really good question, and obviously a complicated question. I think in some ways I think there's a bit more nuance to the story of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. So you're right, you know, there's, based on the census, the Canadian census, which measures ethnic origin and heritage. You know, I think in the last census, it's something like 1.4 million people claimed to have Ukrainian ancestry. So that's a lot. And it's one of the largest ethnic groups in Canada today. But I think but it's multi-generational. So this includes people that trace their ancestry back 4 generations, 5 generations. And so these questions in the census about ancestry really don't speak to issues of engagement and how important they're them. They do anything that is in their everyday lives connected to Ukraine and being Ukrainian Canadian. And so I think the number is a little bit misleading in terms of the number of Ukrainian Canadians that actively participate in, you know, organizations that know Ukrainian or that know the Ukrainian language or speak Ukrainian at home. So that number is quite a bit smaller. So the number of people that are kind of actively engaged in diasporic projects, I think, is quite a bit less than that 1.4 million, but who knows what that number is. I think in terms of the politics of the Ukrainian diaspora, I think it's true that the Ukrainian diaspora is influential, but it's probably not as influential as it might appear from the outside. So certainly, you know, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which is the umbrella organization representing various Ukrainian Canadian organizations, they're pretty well organized. They have, you know, they have skills and savvy in terms of lobbying, you know, government officials, politicians, and so on. But I think it's important not to overstate how much power they actually have in terms of policy, shaping government policy. I think there's a concern in some quarters in Canada, or there's an argument in some quarters in Canada that diasporas, whether it's the Ukrainian diaspora or the Tamil diaspora or the Vietnamese diaspora, whatever, there's a concern in some quarters that diasporas play too much of a role in shaping Canadian policy and shaping Canadian foreign policy in particular. And I think that it's important not to overstate how much power diasporas do have politically, including the Ukrainian diaspora, because, I mean, we were talking earlier about the turbine issue, that the diaspora wasn't powerful enough to prevent that from happening, although the Ukrainian World Congress, which is the president of the Ukrainian World Congress, which is the umbrella organization globally for a number of diaspora organizations, they're filing an appeal in federal court for the federal court to undertake a judicial review of that decision. Whether that's going to be successful or not, I obviously have no idea how that's going to play itself out. So yes, the diaspora has influence, but I think it's important not to overstate how much influence it does have over Canadian policy, because if it did, you'd think that it would have been successful in preventing that. The diaspora has also been calling, the Ukrainian World Congress and the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, UCC. They've been calling for a no-fly zone, for NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine since the war started. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And so limits to the power that the diaspora has to sort of shape and determine policy in this country. Having said that, I suppose it is interesting that the Ukrainian diaspora has continued to be active for, Ukrainians in Canada have always had an interest in what is going on in Ukraine ever since, the first settlers arrived 125 years ago. And so that too, I think, in a sense, needs to be explained. And I think, again, there's I think a big part of the story of what sustained the political and social vitality of the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, was the Second World War and the post-war displaced people who arrived in Canada, who felt it was their mission to not just see, at some point in the future, a non-communist independent Ukraine exist, but also in the context of, that ongoing process of Russification after during the Soviet times and that kind of proceeded at different paces in Ukraine before 1991, felt that it was part of their mission to maintain Ukrainian language and customs and identity in the context of that threat. And so that was really a big driver of the Ukrainian diaspora community organizations from, obviously 1947 till independence in 1991 and after. So it's yeah.
Well, you have, it's like a mixed answer. Yeah? So it's good to be back. So Vic was explaining that more like maybe, I think, relativizing the idea of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada as a political power. So you make some notes and said, well, okay, it is, but don't overestimate it. Huh? So in that sense, that's what you were saying, the point you were making. And the second thing which you're making, that it's a kind where this its own narrative starts in the Ukrainian diaspora as a political diaspora, also about working on this idea of Ukraine as an independent nation after the Second World War. Reminds me of a passage in your book about 1917 in 1921 in North America, where you have this. I enjoyed that. This journal Svoboda, who made really a statement like, these are the 11 things you should do as an Ukrainian. Sometimes it looks that Ukraine as a nation was not, that's not true, of course, but was not created in Ukraine, but also, and especially in the diaspora. That's as how I see this. So it's what's happening in the United States and Canada and so on. So when are you a good Ukrainian? So this question. So, yeah, it's very interesting. So, and
well, that too is a very interesting question. What makes a good Ukrainian? And again, I think for some time in the 1960s and 70s, there was a sense of if you were living in the diaspora and couldn't speak Ukrainian, that was sort of a marker of being a in-group member versus an out-group member. And I think that's changed a lot, because most of that 1.4 million people that in terms of Ukrainian identity, most of them don't speak Ukrainian at home, or they don't even know Ukrainian. So the vast majority of people that identify as Ukrainian Canadian, I haven't looked at the actual statistics, but in terms of mother tongue, use of Ukrainian at home and so on, that number is quite a bit smaller than the 1.4 million. So language has been kind of an issue within the Ukrainian Canadian diaspora. And of course now for a long time after 1991, maybe I'm going in too many different directions, but it's for the diaspora, it was the Russian speakers in Ukraine that the diaspora had a real problem with, and trying to figure out who they were, what their loyalties were, what their identity was. Are they Ukrainian? How loyal are they to Ukraine? How attached are they to Ukraine? And so that the Russian language issue has been a real sticking point and difficult one for the diaspora to negotiate, and whether a Russian-speaking person from Ukraine, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, is whether they're an authentic Ukrainian or not. And I think the diaspora has kind of got over that question, or certainly the war has resolved that question, because I think we've all seen the YouTube videos of Russian speakers confronting the Russian soldiers and yelling at them in Russian and swearing at them in Russian, like what, and so I think that the war is kind of probably settled, I hope once and for all, that Russian speakers in Ukraine are just as loyal Ukrainians as Ukrainian speakers. So again, the question of what makes an authentic Ukrainian is actually really interesting.
In your book, you actually mention something like a becoming Ukrainian in diaspora. That's an interesting question because people who moved there in early 20s were not considering themselves Ukrainians, right? The Ukrainians they were called Ruthenians. I remember I found the records of my great-grandfather who were moving and from the ship where he actually got on the he got in Hamburg, and from Hamburg he moved to America, and he was recorded as the Ruthenian as a nationality, and becoming a Ukrainian in diaspora. I'm thinking now, Ukrainians have shaped into a nation of a different type in 2014 at Maidan. We became a totally different kind of a nation. We had this long story of who really Ukrainians are. They have to be Ukrainian speaking, or they have to be of Ukrainian ethnic background. What really makes a Ukrainian. And we saw some birth of a political nation in 2014. And I think right now we are having this really interesting process that is happening to many Ukrainians, people, citizens of Ukraine, who really are shaping into a different type of Ukrainians because of the events with the Russia right now, because of the war. And really for that, Russian language doesn't make much difference. Where it makes difference is this Putin's declaration that Russian language is a marker of Russian world, and because of this, he has the right to come and to take over this place because people are speaking Russian, and that has to be changed. Mm-hmm. But now, I think we will see a very interesting with this new wave of Ukrainians moving into Canada. We will see some really interesting changes also in the Ukrainian diaspora, in the identity of Ukrainian diaspora. Who are these people that come to Canada right now? What they think of themselves as Ukrainians, what they think of themselves as what they see as their role in the society. Can you say a few words about this becoming Ukrainian in diaspora, and then maybe sustaining it or developing it?
Okay. Yeah, let me go back to the point you made about I think it was your grandfather, you said, Arissa. I think that's absolutely right. When Ukrainian immigrants first started to arrive in Canada and the US, I think their understanding of themselves and who they were as people were largely regional understandings. So Ruthenians, but there were, in Canada, they were also called Galicians, Bukovinians, and so there were this bundle of, and so it's not clear, like that was part of their self-definition, but then it was also part of the way that the Canadian government defined them as well. So you see these categories in the Canadian census as well. In 1901 and 1910, there were X thousand Galicians and X thousand Bukovinians, and the category of Ukrainian, I think, really first started to make its appearance in the Canadian census. It was either 1920, I think it was 1921. So, 40 some years after the arrival, that identity sort of became solidified. So I think you're right, that in some ways, the sense of Ukrainianness, at least in the diaspora, was formed as a result of migration. If you fast forward to today, I think you're right. I think that this moment, this moment in history is going to be very interesting. I think after Ukrainian independence in 1991, when exit controls were eased and Ukrainians could leave and move. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the organizations in the diaspora were really struggling with understanding who these Ukrainians were and whether they were part of the same imagined community that they thought they were part of. And part of the fracture was around language and Russian speakers. I think that fracturing and that understanding is changing, as I say, in part because of the war and in part because of Maidan. And certainly, Orissa, you've been closer to this on the ground than I have, and I haven't studied it systematically, but I share too with you the sense that Maidan really initiated and sparked a change and sort of shift from what sociologists call ethnic nationalism versus civic nationalism, and Maidan really kind of started to allowed Ukrainians to, or encouraged Ukrainians to start thinking in more inclusive terms about who was Ukrainian, and it was about citizenship and birth and belonging, and language and ethnicity were less important. So in a sense, I'm glad to hear that you're confirming what I've been thinking all along. I think there's still some remnants of that. And so if you apply that distinction between ethnic versus civic nationalism, it also kind of makes sense when it comes to diasporas and how they think about their own imagined communities, whether the diaspora thinks of itself in ethnic terms or civic terms. So I think that shift is slowly starting to happen among the longer settled Ukrainians in Canada. The new arrivals, I think, are they're gonna introduce another dynamic, and I think that maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but one of the really heartening things that has been going on in Canada is the tremendous level of mobilization within not just the Ukrainian Canadian community, but within Canada more generally, to support the people that have been coming and who've been displaced as a result of war. So Ukrainian Canadians of different generations and backgrounds have been opening up their homes to host Ukrainians who've been displaced. Ukrainian Canadians are, fundraising for various projects for Ukraine, and so on. So I think that as Ukrainians in Canada become more familiar with this new wave, I think that understanding of who's a Ukrainian is going to change as well. Actually, I'm just thinking I should probably go back to another issue just very briefly. And I think that the other thing, in response to Arissa's original question a few minutes ago about the politicization of the Ukrainian diaspora, and what sustains it, and in a sense why it's been relatively successful, is the ongoing threat that Ukraine has been facing, or the ongoing threats that Ukraine as a nation, as a state has been facing. You know, independence, yes, was seen as kind of mission accomplished. Yes, it's now independent, it's free from Soviet control, but then the ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine since independence, whether it's through, you know, through political parties, or, you know, in the context of Maidan, and now the war, those external threats, those threats to Ukraine's existence, are somewhat ironically, I think, they help to sustain the diaspora and help to sustain the interest of the diaspora into Ukraine. I was telling Ruud, I was rereading my book that I published in 2002, 20 years ago. And I remember going to a conference, it was in 1999 or 2000. And the question at the conference was, will the Ukrainian diaspora exist in 2020? Because there was a sense that, you know, the mission was accomplished. There's nothing else for us to do. We should focus on our own, you know, issues and so on. And so I'd forgotten about that, and actually might write something about that now that it's prompted my memory. But it's those continuing external threats, existential threats to Ukraine, that I think is what keeps the fire lit for many people in the diaspora.
I think that what you were saying, and what Larissa also was saying about this influence of Maidan, the revolution of dignity, and this changed self-understanding also in Ukraine. So in itself, not major in ethnic terms, but in civic terms, and like Irina would say, a kind of supplement. The ethnic side won't disappear. So, but you're adding something to it. And I was wondering if this is what it means for the diaspora, maybe also in articulating what kind of war it actually is, because if the I don't know if this is happening in Ukraine, in Canada, but if you as a diaspora see yourself as a civic diaspora, in a sense that doesn't mean that it also could mean that you say, well, also the relation to my ancestors isn't decisive, but my relation to the world, so to say. And you can become this a kind of paradoxal, a kind of cosmopolitan diaspora, so to say. So you articulate a kind of citizenship that's no longer primarily related to nation or ethna, so to say, but relation to citizenship. And that's maybe also something as a message to not only to Ukrainians, but also to us, to me in the Netherlands and so on. And if you think about this war, this is not a war about a nation or an ethna, but this is a war about being citizens and being able to live in dignity in a sovereign state, so to say. And that could make the Ukrainian diaspora a force of development in the world, you say, to see us also as world citizens, not so much as it's not so much as being part of let's say I'm Dutch and that's basically it. So we have to understand ourselves in a much broadly way, and that Ukrainian diaspora is actually conscious or unconscious as articulating this as a message to the world. I don't know how you see that. Maybe the test is how is the war articulated in Canada actually by the Ukrainian diaspora?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I'm going to actually have to pause and think about it for a second. I think the way that the diaspora should be framing the war, and whether it is or isn't, I'm not sure. So I'm going to hesitate a little bit here. But I think you're right. I think the way that the diaspora should articulate its understanding of the war, well, it's complicated, right? Because, on the one hand, there's contradictory narratives here, right? Where Putin and the Russian authorities see this as a conflict between the West, NATO and the West. But at the same time, going back a long time, and including to Putin's, more recent statements, his letter in November of last year, that basically Ukrainians don't exist or shouldn't exist as a people. So they've been framing it as both a war against Ukrainians, but also a war against the West. And I think that those dual narratives are sort of competing within the diaspora as well. And in a sense, they're both, I think they're both right? On the one hand, clearly Putin does not think Ukraine should exist, and Ukrainians are a legitimate ethnicity. So in some ways it is a war against ethnicity. But then the way that the war is conducted in Ukraine, the cruise missiles don't make a distinction between whether you're a Ukrainian speaker or a Russian speaker. And the tanks didn't make a distinction between whether you were a Ukrainian speaker or Russian speaker. So it's a contradictory narrative on a number of different counts, and which narrative is going to come to kind of prevail in the diaspora. That's a good question.
Okay.
I don't have a great answer to it right now.
I think maybe it's the good questions are maybe always questions you don't have the answers to, what makes you think, of course. So in that sense. So is there actually, because where we started last time was 2 weeks ago, discussing the diaspora, one of our, let's say, question was that our also what we want to investigate is how to develop or how to support or whatever a kind of a third. Is there a third front? You could say. So we have the military, we have the politicians, and we have the civic. And could the diaspora be the core of such a second, third front? So second, third, a bit strange, but such a third front. And for me, as in Holland, this question becomes, because it was so, well, a lot of activities going on, also by the Dutch diaspora, very much, but there's also some, well, questions how to develop this as in a more effective way. And I was just wondering, is there a kind of strategy in the Canadian diaspora, but you could say, well, these are the objectives, this is what we want to achieve around this war, how to do the solidarity, how the best practices and so on, what the world and we can learn from. What would you say about that thing?
Yeah, I don't think, my sense is that there's not a coherent diaspora position on what should be done. I think it's more local. It's a little bit, it's more, I wouldn't say it's haphazard, but it's more situational and contextual in terms of strategies. So a lot of the diaspora mobilization in Canada at the individual level and at the what I call the meso level, the sort of organizational level, has been to support Ukrainians who've left and who've moved to Ukraine. So, the organizations in some of the diaspora organizations are working with the immigrant settlement sector in Canada to, provide Ukrainian language guides to settling in Canada, because moving to Canada, moving to any new country is really hard. You have to learn the ropes and how to get a driver's license and find a physician and housing and so on. And so at the local level, I think many Ukrainian Canadians and Ukrainian Canadian organizations, in some ways, that's one of their main preoccupations right now is helping figure out how to accommodate the arrivals from Ukraine, because they're not technically refugees. The Canadian government does not define them as refugees, and there are sort of reasons for that. And so they're not eligible for some of the forms of support that refugees are eligible for. But on the other hand, they are eligible for other forms of support. And so I think the Ukrainian diaspora has really stepped up and filled in the gap. So certainly supporting and again, they're not really immigrants either, because they're only given temporary resident permits. I don't want to get into the weeds about Canadian immigration bureaucracy, because that can take 3 days. But so I think that the diaspora is doing a pretty good job in terms of organizing to provide support for Ukrainians who've left and who've moved to Canada. But I think educational institutions, and so, for example, I think the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I mentioned that I'm working with Natalia Konenko-Friesen on the post-1991 immigration project. But I think they've been very active in hosting webinars and seminars and workshops to combat Russian disinformation. And so I think the information war is, in a sense, a third front that needs to also be paid attention to. And so I think, scholars, educators, and educational institutions can play a role, and they are playing a role in doing what they can to combat Russian disinformation, to challenge some of these crazy narratives that are coming out of Ukraine about Nazis in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. and denazification, and the battle over the battle over the historical memory of World War II, or the historical memories of World War II, and Bandera and the OUN and UPA and who they were and what they represented. Those battles are ongoing, and that sort of history feeds the Russian war machine. And so I think that academics have a responsibility to do what they can to engage with that, with those narratives, to challenge them, contextualize what happened in Ukraine during the Second World War, who Bandera was, what the OUN and UPA represented, and who, that whole history. So I think that's an important front. But as I say, I don't think there's an organized strategy within the diaspora in Canada. I think the war is still too fresh. It's too hot, and there's every day seems like there's new issues, whether it's the turbines, at the policy level. There's a whole other level, as I say, of diaspora engagement that really depends on the context. So whether a common front emerges within the Ukrainian Canadian diaspora about what it should be doing, maybe that might happen. But I think right now people are mobilizing to provide the support they can in the ways that they think are going to be the most meaningful. And certainly for, you know, many individuals and organizations, it's the immigration settlement story and providing folks with, because housing is a major issue in Canada. The cost of housing is expensive. It's in short supply. And so that's a real crisis. And so figuring out just where, you know, these 100 or 200 or some are predicting 300,000 people are going to live is a major issue. And so I think it's those kind of everyday practical issues that are probably going to be, that are seizing the you know, ordinary people in the diaspora's consciousness right now, and seizing a lot of the organizational kind of energy, because it's something that they can do and there's a concrete result, right?
Yeah, I can understand that. So, but still the question fascinates me, and even begins to fascinate me more, because I more or less had expected that there would be a kind of common strategy or a core of a strategy in Canada because of the history of the diaspora in Canada, which I totally, also from my own experience, I totally understand this overwhelming of what's happening in the world, and refugees coming in and taking care of people and so on. And before you know, the day is over again, you know. And still, on the other hand, the idea fascinates me, but so much Ukrainians living worldwide in the diaspora, and this mobilizing, so of this what you will say, these information war. You are part of this. I read some of your pieces about it. It's of course very important, but I somehow have the fantasy of mobilizing it would be very important for basically defeating Putin. So thinking about this, is it possible to develop a kind of strategy, kind of common goal, which helps us to mobilize ourselves and our, so the same in the Netherlands, my fellow countrymen, because the first month, 2 months, 3 months even, the war was on the front page. And you see now it's a bit disappearing, and people see that it's disappearing, and we have other stuff, what we're talking about. While for me, this is our decisive moment in history, so to say. Yeah, so, and that's why I think for me personally, this question won't go away from me. So what to do with the diaspora? That is basically what it is. So I don't know how you see it. Maybe, or you see that, or is
yeah.
Well, let's Victor talk first.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, Ruud. I think that you know, one of my concerns is, you know, I think sociologists have this term compassion fatigue, and so you know, I think as the war wears on, compassion fatigue is inevitably going to set in, and other problems are going to arise for Canadians and Americans and Europeans. And so I think that compassion fatigue had set in before the war, with the occupation of Donbass and Crimea, and the annexation of Crimea, right? That was a frozen conflict that kind of fell off the world's radar. And so it strikes me, and actually this was the project that I prepared for my Fulbright before the war started. I was proposing to study in the United States how the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States was trying to persuade Americans to care about what was going on in Ukraine in that frozen conflict. Now, of course, much of the world cares about what's going on. But I think that it's that compassion fatigue, which is inevitably going to set in as this war goes on. And it strikes me that one of the roles of the diaspora will inevitably be to figure out how to combat that compassion fatigue and make sure that this war, or try to make sure that this war is resolved in Ukraine's favor, whatever form that might take. And maybe I hope that's realistic, but I think that's certainly one of the things that the diaspora can do systematically in an organizational level. I think they were not, I don't want to be too harsh and too judgmental, but like I say, I think, by 2020, 2021, that frozen conflict in the Donbass had fallen off the radar, and the world didn't care about it, and so the diaspora wasn't particularly successful in keeping that on the world's radar. And whether it's able to do this now, maybe it's different. I think the scale of the war is so much greater now that might be easier for them to do.
Yeah, it would be a very important strategic task to take in this talk and these things to combat it, what you say, compassion fatigue. And so I know this from COVID. That's why I heard it. Nurses who had compassion fatigue after 2 years of COVID. So maybe to finish this up a bit. So and maybe this is also a bit interesting about this, what these battles are going on. And so you wrote also something about these battles and differences between the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and the Russian diaspora in Canada. So, and you said, well, I remember that you say something, the Russian diaspora isn't too enthusiastic about the war in Ukraine. Is this still true? And to ask a ridiculous question, could they be an ally? Or is it too difficult for them to be that?
Yeah, so that piece I wrote kind of in, in the early weeks of the war, and just kind of wondering about where the Russian diaspora fit in to what was going on. And I think to me, it's fascinating that there's almost no scholarly research on the so-called Russian diaspora. There's a little bit in the UK, but Russians and Russian speakers are huge immigrant populations in Canada and the United States. They're not as well organized organizationally. Actually last fall I did a bit of a organizational scan of Russian diaspora organizations in Canada and the US, and there was a handful, maybe a dozen total in the US and Canada, whereas there's dozens and dozens of Ukrainian American and Ukrainian Canadian organizations. And when I was looking at those organizations before the war, a lot of them were about promoting cultural relations between the US and Russia and so on. I think someone needs to do a more systematic study of the Russian diaspora and its how it frames the war. And again, in the early moments of the war, it was relatively silent or made relatively innocuous statements about, there should be peace on both sides and let's just get everyone together and solve this and so on. So there's that strand. Whether whether members of the Russian diaspora live in fear of speaking out against the war. I think that's a reasonable question, because certainly speaking out against the war in Russia is not safe. And you get yourself into legal trouble and physical trouble if you speak out against the war there. So whether that fear translates into the diaspora, I think, is an interesting question. The question about whether the Russian diaspora is conceived by the Russian state as a soft power tool to promote Russian interests abroad is a really interesting question that I think needs more research on. Whether the Russian diaspora is, whether the Russian diaspora loves Russia but hates the Putin regime is another question, I think, that needs to be answered. So whether there's going to be a common front between the two, I kind of doubt it, just because I don't know. It's hard to say, but again, it's so complicated, right? Because you go to a place like Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, right, where it's there's this Russian-speaking community, and maybe they're part of the Russian diaspora, but those are Russian speakers from Russia, from Ukraine, from Kazakhstan, from Georgia, from Armenia. And so, they have multiple loyalties and multiple attachments to countries of origin. And so whether they form one voice, whether the Russian speakers, because that's what Ruski Mir really kind of conceives of the Russian diaspora as Russian speakers. And so whether those Russian speakers are going to speak with one voice about what's going on in Russia, I kind of doubt it. I think, I think there's probably a lot of soul searching within that community. I mean, I was reading a piece about Russians in Estonia, and how, in the early days of the war, they were supportive of the Russian narrative, but now that's changing, and they're starting to raise questions and starting to become more critical of the Russian narrative. So it's a fascinating question. I wish I had a better answer, but I think this is where some more academic research could really kind of be valuable.
Yeah, thank you. It's also that it's like this saying, it's hard to predict, especially the future, and it's even harder to predict the future when there's a war going on. So this is actually what's happening. So we are talking now for more than an hour already. So I think I want to end with thank you for sharing your thoughts and your insights about these about the Canadian diaspora and its background, and it still gives us a lot to think about. So especially me, and I think also Arissa. So thank you very much, Vic, for being with us, and I hope we will meet again somewhere, somehow, someplace. This place would be nice too. So again, thank you very much for being here. Well,
thank you, Ruud and Arissa, for the invitation. It's you're doing an important work, and for someone like me to be able to be part of this is quite. I don't know. It feels like I'm at least doing something in the context of feeling relatively powerless to be able to talk about these things and at least explain to people a little bit more about what's going on. contextually. Maybe that's the small contribution that people like me can make. So appreciate the opportunity.
So a lot of small contribution make one big one, so that's what I think. So thank you. I'm gonna stop this the live stream now. So